Many European nations are following the United States in backing Guaido as leading Venezuela. And in a recent interview, President Donald Trump continues to say that a military option is still on the table. RT Sara Montes de Oca joins me. Sara, a lot of people are very scared at the thought of a military operation of United States soldiers in Venezuela.
That's right, Scottie. Venezuela is now facing a political and a constitutional crisis. Today, 11 more European nations joined the U.S. in recognizing opposition leader Juan Guaido as Venezuela's interim president. The move comes after Maduro refused to accept an ultimatum. Last week, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Spain gave Maduro until Sunday to call on new elections. Maduro said, "We don't accept ultimatums from anyone." Ironically, Maduro is calling for the National Assembly Parliament, which is opposition-controlled, to have early elections. Now, he declared there's no dictatorship in Venezuela, nor will there be. In an interview with Face the Nation, Donald Trump said the U.S. military force in Venezuela is still on the table, adding that he turned down a meeting with President Maduro several months ago.
Well, I don't want to say that, but certainly it's something that's on the, it's an option. I decided at the time, no, because so many really horrible things have been happening in Venezuela. When you look at that country, that was the wealthiest country of all in that part of the world, which is a very important part of the world. And now you look at the poverty, and you look at the anguish, and you look at the crime, and you look at all of the things happening. So I think the process is playing out very, very big, tremendous protests.
Meanwhile, President Maduro had a message of his own for Mr. Trump.
Stop. Stop, Donald Trump. Stop there. You're committing mistakes that will stain your hands with blood, and you will leave the presidency stained with blood. Stop. We, Venezuela, have the capacity for dialogue and understanding. Let's respect ourselves. Or are you going to repeat Vietnam in Latin America?
Today marks the beginning of Venezuela's government first week without U.S. oil revenue. Last week, the U.S. sanctioned state-run oil firm Petróleos de Venezuela. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, and the country's economy is heavily dependent on oil exports, which makes these U.S. sanctions the most severe on Maduro's government to date. The U.S. is the biggest market for Venezuelan crude oil, and even though the U.S. had already cut back their purchases in recent years, it was still the second largest source of crude imports. Now, U.S. producers are saying that it will be hard for them to fill that void. Over the weekend, U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton said the U.S. is transporting humanitarian aid for the people of Venezuela by preparing critical supplies requested by opposition leader Juan Guaido. But Maduro refuses to accept the humanitarian crisis in his country. Venezuela does not have a humanitarian crisis. Venezuela has a political crisis. Venezuela has an economic crisis. We have a huge economic war. Scottie, the people of Venezuela are already suffering from hyperinflation, shortage of food and medicine, and mass migration of citizens from neighboring countries. Now, this is a situation that will likely worsen given the sanctions.
Now, Sara, President Trump in his interview said that Venezuela used to be the richest country in the region. And then you're looking at this, they have the largest oil reserves in the entire world. So where is that money going?
Well, many critics, many people are concerned that there's embezzlement of that money. Not only that, they're also repaying some of their debt to China, Russia, and other countries who have lent them money, and that's where they get a lot of their payment method to paying them back. And their sale of oil has decreased in the last couple of years. And like I reported, the U.S. has decreased their
Once again, Sara, we're talking about oil and not necessarily about what is going on in the streets with the relief of people. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
For more, we're joined by Dimitri Lascaris. He's a lawyer and he's a journalist who is joining us in Caracas, Venezuela. Thank you for joining us, Dimitri.
Thank you for having me on.
Okay, so I have to ask you, because you follow a lot of Canada issues as well, what do you make of the Lima Group meeting in Canada to discuss the crisis in Venezuela and how to support overwhelmingly with such a large package Maduro?
Well, I think let's step back and understand what the Lima Group is. It's essentially led by Canada. It's joined by a smattering of states from Latin America that had right-leaning governments, including Mexico. And, you know, although the United States is not formally part of it, and I think that's probably designed to give it a patent of legitimacy because the United States has such a horrific record of military and other forms of intervention in the domestic affairs of Latin American states, it is nonetheless towing the line on the U.S. administration's agenda, which is to change the regime in Venezuela. And I think that this aid package is essentially designed to up the ante for the Venezuelan government and to entice the Venezuelan people to support the whole project of removing the elected president from power. It's very interesting today that Justin Trudeau, when he was asked about this after the Lima Group meeting in Canada, he invoked Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution because that's the one that's being relied upon by the opposition as a justification for the self-declaration of presidential powers by Juan Guaido. But as I read Article 233, it simply doesn't apply here. The one part of it that could potentially apply talks about the president becoming unavailable to perform his duties. President Maduro is not unavailable. He's not incapacitated. He hasn't fled the country. In fact, he's forcefully asserting that he continues to be the president. And therefore, I think Article 233 of the Constitution really doesn't provide any legal basis for what is being done here by the Lima Group and others.
Well, Dimitri, I have to ask you a question because there's not been a lot of unification between South America and even Canada with the United States on a lot of different issues, a lot of different policies. And yet, in this case, there is a large contingent that are getting behind President Trump and what the administration's chances are. What does Canada have to gain by promising $53 million? And what do these other Latin American countries have to gain with seeing a regime change in Venezuela?
Well, I think I would suggest that, in fact, the foreign policies of all of these governments align overwhelmingly with the foreign policy of the United States government. That's certainly the case with Canada. There has been the odd exception of Canada departing from U.S. foreign policy. For example, it refused to participate in Iraq. But a former Canadian foreign minister once said that because we occasionally depart from U.S. foreign policy, it's all the more important that in many instances, in the vast majority of instances, we comply with the demands of our American friends. In Canada's case, this is a very, very resource-rich country. The Canadian economy is hugely dependent upon the mining sector. There are extraordinary opportunities here for money to be made by the Canadian extractive sector, and frankly, I think that's a big part of the Canadian government's motivation for supporting the Trump regime change agenda in Venezuela.
Okay, so over the weekend, there were a lot of protests supporting Maduro as well as the opposition. Tell me about what is it like there on the ground right now? And we've seen different pictures. Some look very ragged and haggard in their protesters. Others look like they're just going to a sporting event. So what is the general feeling and the emotions that are there on the streets?
Well, on Saturday, I had the opportunity to attend both the opposition demonstration, which was held in Mercedes, a relatively affluent part of the city, and also to attend the Chavista demonstration on Avenida Bolivar in the western part of the city. Both of them were extremely large protests, and there were, I would say, tens of thousands of persons. I can't be more precise than that with any confidence at both rallies. I can't say with any confidence which one was larger. They were certainly major demonstrations of support for the government and against the government. And what struck me as somebody who comes from Canada and hears all the time that Maduro is a brutal dictator is that there was a complete absence on the ground as far as I could see. And I walked along a major boulevard with the opposition protesters for 6 or 7 kilometers. So I was with them for quite some time. I never saw any police dressed in riot gear. I didn't see any military personnel. I saw a smattering of police officers, a few dozen, who appeared to be concerned with nothing other than the direction of the traffic. And these people, let's recall, the people who were out there demonstrating that day are showing their support for somebody who is openly fomenting a military coup in Venezuela, Juan Guaido. And despite that fact, I saw no attempt whatsoever to curtail the right of dissent of these protesters. And in fact, I've seen far worse in the countries of the West. I've attended many protests in Canada, the United States, and Europe. It is now routine to see militarized police officers there, even when there is no palpable threat of damage to property or threats to human beings. That being said, and despite the fact that these were peaceful protesters, there was no violence as far as I could ascertain, no threat of violence as far as I could ascertain. The feelings on the ground amongst these people are very intense, very vehement. This is a deeply divided society. At night, I can't see anybody, just about anybody roaming the streets. My hotel, which is a major international chain, is virtually empty. Very few people are willing to venture out into the dark. And when you talk to people on the ground, both the Chavistas and the opposition supporters, they feel very strongly about their cause, and this could all end very badly if we don't handle the situation delicately and with a great deal of diplomacy.
Well, that's the question. What does the opposition think is going to happen? How is their life going to be different with a regime change? How do they think it's going to be better, or do they think it's going to, how are they going to think it's going to improve?
Well, I think that the fact of the matter is there are a lot of people within the opposition movement now who think, who've been suffering so long in the crisis, the economic crisis in Venezuela, that they'll just take anything else. And you hear people say this, they'll just take anything other than the current regime because of the economic suffering. And they don't particularly care, or they're not in a position to judge what the causes are. Certainly, the U.S. sanctions have a great deal to do with the suffering of the Venezuelan people, but they're just concerned about getting food on the table, taking care of their kids, having jobs. And so they just want change, these opposition supporters. I think what they're not realizing is that in the long term, what is going to happen is you're going to have in place here a government that is not going to be protecting, for example, the resources of Venezuela in the long-term interests of the Venezuelan people. It'll probably engage in a privatization program. It'll sell off assets. In the long run, regrettably, if the regime changes, you are going to see a neoliberal program that is not going to serve the interests of ordinary Venezuelans, and particularly the poor.
Right. Dimitri, thank you for sharing your observations from the streets of Caracas.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.